All right, so the title of my talk today is God a Misogynist? Is God a misogynist? And a misogynist, by the way, is someone who strongly dislikes women, if you didn't know the meaning of that word. It's basically someone who strongly dislikes women, they're prejudiced against women. And many feminists and atheists argue that the God of the Bible is portrayed as a misogynist. It is said that the Bible regards women as the mere property of men and of lesser value than men. The feminist author Karen Garst argues that religion like Christianity are, quote, the last cultural barrier to gender equality. She also says that biblical Christianity has historically participated in the, quote, subjugation and degradation of women. She further goes on to say that the Bible is, quote, not sacred or the inspired word of a deity because it was written by men who believed women were their property. The feminist writer Taslima Nasreen writes, quote, if one believes in women's rights, one first has to cast away one's religious identity. All religions are anti-women. No one can be pro-woman while supporting anti-woman dogmas. So, that's the cultural narrative among many feminist critics today, critics of Christianity. They believe that Christianity is directly opposed to women. So, is that true? I don't think it is, obviously. I think that this narrative is false, as we'll learn. But before we get there, I want to highlight the importance of this issue. Unless you've been living under a rock for the past couple of years, you've kind of noticed that we're in the middle of a social revolution right now, aren't we? A couple of years ago, a famous film producer named Harvey Weinstein, he was exposed as a serial sexual abuser. Over 80 women have made allegations against him, including rape. These allegations sparked what has come to be called the hashtag #MeToo movement, and this movement has been shining a bright light on how women are mistreated and abused by powerful men. This is happening everywhere from Hollywood to the highest political offices. Women are mistreated. So there are a couple observations that we can make in light of everything that's going on here. The first one is this: despite all of our social progress in the West, women are still being abused. Despite all of our social progress in the West, women are still being abused, exploited, and degraded by men. This is taking place, by the way, even in places like Hollywood, as I mentioned, which is supposedly run by the most enlightened and progressive among us, people who have ditched archaic worldviews like Christianity and have fully embraced modern feminism. Even in those places, as I said, as we learn in the last couple of years, women are still being mistreated. Despite all of feminism's social advancements, women are still treated as objects. They are still exploited. They are still abused. Dr. Katie McCoy puts this point really well. She says, quote, we women can vote, own businesses, pursue any educational or vocational field, be CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, university presidents, U.S. senators, but we still have to be careful going to the grocery store at night. We still have to walk fast with our eyes forward and pray that the cat-calling men don't become aggressive. We still have to be hypervigilant in a parking garage. For all of the social activism in the last 60 years, rape culture, sexual harassment, and misogyny have not been eradicated or educated out of our society or reformed away. Come on in. For all of our social progress, humanity's core still remains unchanged, and for all of our social advantages, women still face oppression and sexual abuse. That women have achieved unparalleled independence yet still contend for basic safety and public value is a sobering cultural commentary, end quote. So what does that tell us? What does that tell us? Women, despite all of these social advancements, women are still not being protected in society. It tells us that the problem in our society cannot be solved by more of the same. The feminist movement has, in other words, been utterly ineffective in actually helping bring about true change for women, the modern feminist movement, I should say. Women are still being oppressed and mistreated, and the reason for that is that we are dealing with a moral problem. We're dealing with a moral problem, not simply a social problem. And this leads to my second observation, number 2. Our society is hungry, it's aching for justice and moral revolution. Female oppression is a moral problem. The claim that men shouldn't abuse women is a moral claim. Demanding that men, quote unquote, do better is a moral demand. Even the idea that women ought to be valued and protected from abuse is a moral value. But these moral values assume something, don't they? These moral values and duties and ideals assume an objective moral standard. However, if there is no God, there literally is no objective moral standard. Think about it this way. If atheism is true, then on what basis do women or men have any objective moral worth at all? We're merely the accidental byproduct of chance, no different than any other living organism on the speck of dirt we call Earth. We've all evolved from primordial goo just the same as mosquitoes and rats. If atheism is true, why should we treat human beings as special? Where do we get these delusions that we have these moral obligations toward one another, that people have intrinsic dignity and are worthy of respect, and that they have rights? After all, on the atheistic view, humans are just animals, and animals have no moral responsibility. Think about it. We don't sentence a hyena to prison for murder when it kills a wildebeest. We don't condemn male dolphins as rapists when they forcibly copulate with female dolphins. Why? Because they're just being animals. So if humans are just animals too, then on what basis can we truly say that men should quote unquote do better, as the Me Too movement demands? On what basis can we say that women should be protected? Without God, we have no objective basis for saying that Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein, and all the rest, that what they did was really morally wrong. We can't say it. We can disagree with it, but we can't truly say that it's wrong in any meaningful way. In fact, if God doesn't exist, if life came about only by natural causes whereby the strong overpowers the weak, survival of the fittest, how can we even say that crimes like rape are morally wrong? There was a paper written in 2002 by 2 evolutionary sociobiologists, Randy Thornhill and Craig Palmer. The title of their paper was Why Men Rape. And in this paper, they concluded that rape has a quote-unquote evolutionary basis. So basically, it's not about just control or domination, but it's a sexual impulse within men, they say. Rape evolved as a quote-unquote reproductive strategy. A male who couldn't find a female to agree to mate with him would simply force her to. It was a reproductive strategy. But if the impulse to sexually overpower women is the result of evolution, then within the naturalistic, atheistic worldview, it's not only morally neutral, it's necessary for human survival. Naturalism gives humans no intrinsic value. We're all just animals. The naturalistic worldview gives us no imperative to protect the vulnerable in our society, including women. So, what is the secular solution to this problem? And by the way, everyone agrees that it's a problem. Even the secular atheists, even though they don't have any logical basis for making such a moral judgment, we all agree that it's wrong. In their paper, Thornhill and Palmer, they don't explain why, according to their worldview, behavior such as rape is wrong. They just assume it. And they don't explain how concepts like right and wrong can even exist to begin with, according to their worldview. Nevertheless, they do propose a solution. And what they propose is an education program for young boys that informs them of their evolved sexual desires. This is what they write. They say, quote, "Most of all, the program should stress that a man's evolved sexual desires offer him no excuse whatsoever for raping a woman, and that if he understands and resists those desires, he may be able to prevent their manifestation in sexually coercive behavior." In other words, if men understand why their brains evolved to be what they are, they might be able to stop themselves from raping. In other words, you are an animal, and if you understand that you are an animal, maybe you'll learn to live not like an animal. That's the solution. Inform men that they are purposeless bags of meat, and if they know that, maybe they'll be able to control themselves just because. Even though this desire to rape was evolved as a reproductive strategy, apparently, and it was necessary for human survival, but it's wrong just because, and maybe if we... Anyway, Dr. Katie McCoy does a great job of ripping this apart and exposing the logical flaws in this thinking. Here's what she says. She says, "Even this suggestion implies a moral code that is incongruent with purely biological explanations for such sexually coercive behavior. If sexual assault is an adaptation, upon what moral basis would a man attempt to, quote, prevent its manifestation? Upon what moral basis would a government even penalize a man for such a crime? After all, maybe his brain made him do it." That's the logical conclusion of the atheistic, naturalistic worldview. There is no objective basis for female dignity. There's no objective basis for moral behavior or the imperative to protect the vulnerable, to protect women. Without God, all we're left with is naturalism. And as we've seen, naturalism gives us no real solutions. Secular feminism doesn't work. It hasn't worked, as we've seen over the last couple of years. It cannot bring about true change in society whereby women are valued and protected. So then what does work? What does work? How do we change the world and elevate the status of women? The answer is biblical Christianity. We know that Christianity changes the world because it already has changed the world, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. What I'd like to do now is establish a broad biblical framework on this issue, and I'm just going to throw out a ton of information, and hopefully we'll have time to zero in on some of the difficult passages which on the surface appear to denigrate women a little bit later. But before we do that, it's important that we establish God's overall perspective as revealed in Scripture. The overall message of the Bible clearly affirms the immense value and personhood of women, which is equal to that of men. This perspective is evident in the very beginning of the biblical story. Genesis 1:27 says, "God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them." So here we see that God created both men and women in his image. Being created in God's image, by the way, it not only bestows upon humans intrinsic value, but it elects them to represent God's purposes and will on earth. So that is to say, both men and women are equal in dignity and vocation in God's creation and plan. So already we have a major difference between atheism and biblical Christianity. Atheism says we've all evolved, and even the desire within some men to rape has evolved as a reproductive strategy. Christianity, the biblical worldview, says that men and women are created equal, that we have intrinsic dignity and worth. Human moral worth makes sense only within a theistic worldview, a Christian worldview. Regarding Genesis 1, Dr. Richard Davidson writes, quote, the fundamental equality of man and woman is unhesitatingly proclaimed in the first chapter of the Bible. So feminism doesn't get to steal the credit for the concept that women have equal value to men. The Bible taught that concept first. So this raises a question. If the Bible was hopelessly misogynistic, as feminists claim, then why do women share the special status of bearing God's image along with men? If the Bible taught that women are inferior to men, wouldn't that be clear in the beginning? Wouldn't women be created on the same day as the animals for man to just control? Instead, Scripture teaches that women, just like men, have intrinsic value and purpose. Women even share with men the blessing of dominion over all creation. When we look at the creation of woman, specifically Eve, we read that she was taken from Adam's side. Thus, Eve is represented as Adam's other half, if you will. Mankind is complete without womankind. Man is incomplete without woman. Man needed a partner to fulfill the divine calling of bearing God's image and ruling over creation. Men and women are different, and therefore they need each other to fully fulfill God's will and purposes in creation. When we look at the establishment of marriage, we see that man is to leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife. This teaches us that a man's first loyalty is not to his parents, it's not to his tribe, it's not to the government. His first loyalty is to his wife. He holds fast to her, the Scriptures say, which is a phrase that is often used to express covenant commitment that one is to have toward God. Marriage is a bond wherein the wife is honored, cherished, and protected, and sex is to be enjoyed only within the safe boundaries of that loving covenant commitment between man and wife. Sex is not to be taken from a woman by force. Sex is only to be shared lovingly within that covenant boundary where she feels safe, protected, cherished, honored. Therefore, according to the first 2 chapters of Genesis, women aren't inferior beings. They are not property created to be used and abused by men. They have intrinsic worth, and they are equal partners with men in the divine purpose to glorify God on earth. Now that's just Genesis 1 through 2. But even beyond that, as Paul Copan writes, there are, quote, undeniable affirmations of equality in the Old Testament from theological, historical, and legal perspectives. So after the fall, in the midst of this fallen world and man-made societal structures that have developed within this fallen world, God condescends to meet humans where they are, and what he does is he gently directs them back to the creation ideal as much as possible. So there are hints of this creation ideal that's embedded all over the biblical text. For example, consider the 5th commandment. It says, Exodus 20:12, honor your father and your mother. Honor your father and your mother. Now, many of us who've grown up in church, we've heard this passage so many times that we tend to gloss over it. But think about that for a second, especially in the ancient Near Eastern context when this commandment was originally given. Father and mother are equally worthy of honor within the family. And this, by the way, is in stark contrast to the values of other cultures in the ancient Near East. In other cultures in the ancient Near East, the mother was controlled by the son in the family. The Bible says, no, mother and father are equally worthy of honor. In addition, the Torah expresses the equality of men and women in regard to morality, purity, and justice. Paul Copan writes, quote, the moral and ceremonial laws of Israel presumed that women were not only equal, but also shared equal moral responsibility with the men. We see this in Deuteronomy 29, which teaches that women, along with men, are full members of God's covenant community. Deuteronomy 31 teaches that women, along with men, are fully accountable to God and expected to learn and do His commandments. Women also receive the same benefits as men in the Torah. They're given a Sabbath rest just like men are. They're allowed to participate in the worship services at the temple for feast days and so forth. When you get to the New Testament, the creation ideal of male-female equality and dignity is again fully reaffirmed. Galatians 3 teaches that men and women stand equal before the Father in regard to being justified and included among his people. In contrast to the low view of women, which is expressed in the Greco-Roman culture surrounding the early church, followers of Messiah promoted equality. Followers of Messiah promoted equality and protection for women in the first century. And guess how they did this? Guess how they promoted equality and protection in the first century, in contrast to the Greco-Roman world's low view of women? They did this primarily by adhering to a biblical sexual ethic. A biblical sexual ethic. Let me explain. In the Greco-Roman world, women were truly second-class citizens. Sexual slavery was a normal thing. According to Nancy Pearcey, married men often engaged in extramarital affairs with, quote, girlfriends, mistresses, prostitutes, courtesans, other men, and, most of all, household slaves. That was just the norm in the Greco-Roman culture. This forced their wives to have to compete, quote, with a host of other people for their husband's love and affection. In opposition to this cultural double standard in the Greco-Roman world, Paul taught that infidelity on the part of the husband is no less severe a sin than infidelity on the part of the wife, thus elevating women, equalizing men and women. And this demonstrates, of course, the creation ideal of male-female equality in the garden. According to 1 Corinthians 7, it says a husband not only has authority over his wife's body, but a wife has authority over her husband's body. Christianity's sexual ethic, in addition to its opposition to the practices of abortion and infanticide, these were among the main reasons women in the ancient world flocked to the early church. In fact, one of the earliest criticisms from pagans in the 1st and 2nd century of Christianity was that it was a religion for women. It was criticized as a religion for women because Christianity was so attractive to women. Ironically, the very values that liberated and elevated women in the ancient world are the same values that modern feminists today despise and view as oppressive. In reality, it's the feminist ideals of abortion on demand and casual sex without commitment. Those are the ideals and the modern values that degrade women, that hurt women. In summary, an overall picture of the treatment of women in the Bible reveals that they have immense value and are worthy of honor and protection. There is a lot more that can be said on that point, and like I said, I've written a book on this, which is going to be coming out early next year, and you'll just be amazed at how much there is. But I do want to focus a little bit on some difficult passages in the Bible regarding women and see if we can get some clarity. Before I do that, I do have some that prepared that I can go through. I do want to give you guys a chance to ask questions if there are any difficult passages that on your mind that you would like some comment on. See if I can maybe give some clarity. The two topics that I'm going to talk about is polygamy in the Bible. Does the Bible endorse polygamy? I don't think it does, which I can get into that. And also the commandments regarding rape in the Torah. There's a command in Deuteronomy 28 which seems to say, just a surface reading, that rape victims are required to marry their rapists. So those are the two that I have prepared to go through. Are there any other passages that you guys have in mind that you would like me to talk about or that you're curious about? Yes, Andy?
Yeah, I think one is that women being silent in the church.
Right.
That one, so.
Right, okay. We can talk about that. I do have a chapter on that. Yeah, but basically, just to give a really quick answer to that, we know that that cannot be a general commandment for all time. That Paul is just giving this as a general rule that women are not allowed to speak in church, because in 1 Corinthians 11, he assumes that women are going to be speaking in church. In 1 Corinthians 11, he talks about women praying and prophesying in the church. So there's something else going on in chapter 14 of 1 Corinthians 14 when he talks about how women should be silent. Remember that whole chapter in 1 Corinthians 14, it's not only women, those particular women, that are told to be silent. Lots of other people are told to be silent in the church. Like when we're told to prophesy one at a time, right? So the others are supposed to be silent when someone else is talking. If we're speaking tongues out of order, Paul says, you are to be quiet. So it's not a sexist thing that, that Paul is giving this command. It's a very practical thing because he wants the Corinthian church to maintain orderly services. Because the whole context of that chapter is that this is how you have order. God is not the author of confusion, but that you would serve him in an orderly way. This is how you have order in the congregations. When these things are going on, this is what you are to do to maintain order. So the verses that talk about women being silent, it has to be viewed in light of that. My view is that he's talking about specific women, particularly wives, because, and that's clear in the very next verse, because it says they can ask their husbands at home, right? So he's talking about specific wives who maybe, there's debate on it, but maybe they were interrupting their husbands when their husbands were giving a word or something like that. But it's not a general rule that women are not allowed to speak in church, because other places in 1 Corinthians, the letter, Paul assumes that women are teaching in church and all are speaking in church. So that's just a really quick answer to that. But there's more that can be said for sure. Is there anything else? So I could talk about polygamy. That's a fun one. Polygamy and rape, those are fun topics. Any other questions, though, before I proceed? Very good. All right. Well, I'm going to bring up the topic of polygamy. And this is a very difficult topic. It's no secret that many men in the Bible, including men that are called righteous, like King David and Jacob, they engaged in this practice of polygamy. And the Torah even has regulations concerning polygamous marriages. So this has led some people to conclude that the Bible permits or even endorses this practice. And understandably, this is a very big problem with women, because most women are not cool with sharing their husband with another lady, and that's understandable. So many feminist critics will point to the Bible's alleged endorsement of polygamy and say that this is proof that the Bible views women as property, the property of their husbands. So where do we begin in addressing this? Well, I have 4 points that I want to make here. And unfortunately, because of time, we won't really be able to get into everything and unpack it as much as I'd like. However, get my book when it comes out, because I have an entire chapter that's devoted to this topic. So the 4 points that I want to make are: number 1, like homosexuality, polygamy is a clear deviation from God's original design for marriage as established in creation. Number 2, the Torah does, in fact, prohibit the practice of polygamy. Number 3, rather than being endorsed in the Bible, polygamy is consistently painted in a negative light. And number 4, the passages used to say that polygamy is approved by God are misunderstood. So regarding the first point, that like homosexuality, polygamy is a clear deviation from God's original design for marriage, it's pretty self-evident, right? We've all read Genesis 1 and 2. Monogamy is God's original design for marriage. Also, both Yeshua and Paul affirm monogamy by using the creation ideal as the basis for their other teachings on the topic of marriage. When they talk about what marriage is supposed to look like, they assume monogamy. And while monogamy may not have been the focus of their teachings, it is nevertheless the assumed model in every mention of marriage throughout the New Testament. 1 Corinthians 7:2 says, quote, "Each man shall have his own wife, and each woman her own husband." In 1 Timothy 3, Paul said that elders and deacons within the church are to only have one wife, husbands of one wife, which again reinforces monogamy for everyone, since elders are to be examples of a righteous living to the rest of the church. A prohibition of polygamy can even be logically deduced from Yeshua's statement in Matthew 19 that a man who divorces his wife without warrant and marries another commits adultery. He says, if you divorce your wife and marry another, you commit adultery against your first wife. As the scholar Philip Siegel explains, he says, Yeshua would not call a divorced man's remarriage adultery if he was permitted a second wife, which makes sense. Therefore, if the original marriage was typological for all marriages for all time, as Yeshua and Paul understood it, then polygamy obviously goes against God's intent for marriage. But what about the second point, that the Torah does prohibit polygamy? Because lots of people say, like, well, that sounds nice, David, but you can't say that polygamy is a sin or that it's wrong because there's no commandments against it. There's no commandment in the Torah that says that polygamy is a sin. That's a fair point, okay? But consider this commandment from Leviticus 18:18. Leviticus 18:18 says, "You shall not marry a woman in addition to her sister as a rival while she is alive, to uncover her nakedness." You shall not marry a woman in addition to her sister as a rival while she is alive, to uncover her nakedness. Now, this verse is traditionally understood as prohibiting only one type of polygamy. It's commonly understood that this prohibits only a marriage to two sisters while both are alive. So only that kind of polygamy is prohibited, all right? However, scholars have pointed out several reasons to think that this verse does not necessarily refer to two blood-related sisters, but to two women in general. And if that is correct, we have a direct commandment forbidding polygamy in the Torah. By the way, we know that this interpretation was held by first century Jews. In at least some sects of first century Jews, the Qumran community, for example, they have writings, commentaries, like the Temple Scroll, where they reference Leviticus 18:18 and use it to prohibit polygamy. So they reference Leviticus 18:18, and the way that they interpret that command is as a ban on polygamy generally. And I would argue that the apostles shared that same perspective. But why should we believe that Qumran is correct, that the Qumran community is correct? Why should we believe that Leviticus 18:18 prohibits all polygamy rather than simply prohibiting a marriage between a man and literal sisters? Well, first, in Hebrew, a woman in addition to her sister, which is the verse, do not marry a woman in addition to her sister. In Hebrew, that phrase is Isha el Achota, which literally means a woman to her sister. Scholars have pointed out that this is an idiomatic expression that is always used in the distributive sense of one in addition to another. This is going to get a little bit technical, but bear with me. Exodus 26 speaks of the coupling of curtains and clasps one to another. It talks about coupling curtains and clasps one to another, which is literally a woman to her sister. Isha el Achota. Ezekiel 1 speaks of the wings of the cherubim touching one another. Isha el Achota, a woman to her sister. In Hebrew, that's the exact same phrase that is used in Leviticus 18:18. In fact, every single time the phrase Isha el Achota occurs in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Scriptures, it is used idiomatically. It is used in an idiomatic manner, meaning one to another. This is also the case with the masculine equivalent of the phrase, ish el achiu, which literally is a man to his brother. Every single time the masculine equivalent of the phrase is used, it's used idiomatically. So therefore, when we interpret this phrase in light of its consistent usage, Leviticus 18:18 ought to therefore be understood as saying, "You shall not marry one woman in addition to another." If we interpret the phrase the way it appears everywhere else in the Hebrew Bible, we should understand Leviticus 18:18 to say, "You shall not marry one woman in addition to another." That's not the only reason, by the way. There are several other additional grammatical and exegetical evidences that substantiate this interpretation. And if you're interested, I have an article on my website where I unpack this a little bit more. I also talk about it in my upcoming book. And I wish I could go through it all now, but we simply don't have time. So for now, let's move on to the third point, which is that polygamy is consistently painted in a negative light and therefore discouraged rather than encouraged. So, in addition to the moral and legal statements against polygamy, the biblical authors teach against polygamy through narrative clues. And they do this by revealing the disastrous consequences of the practice. Basically, they're trying to discourage the practice by writing about it and giving clues in the narratives themselves that would discourage it. Dr. Richard Davidson says, in the patriarchal period, there are several biblical examples of plural marriages. Although these biblical narratives provide no explicit verbal condemnation of this practice, the narrator presents each account in such a way as to underscore a theology of disapproval. The record of these polygamous relationships bristles with discord, rivalry, heartache, and even rebellion, revealing the motivations and/or disastrous consequences that invariably accompanied such departures from God's Edenic ideal. We have Abraham, and the disaster with Sarah and Hagar. We have Jacob, and of course we have King Solomon, right? In 1 Kings 11, the biblical author is clear that Solomon's idolatry and eventual downfall were a direct result of his polygamy. The negative consequences of polygamy throughout Israel's history is perhaps a big reason the Jews all but abandoned the practice by the 1st century. David Enstone Brewer writes that polygamy, quote, was not widespread and it was already declining in the 1st century. He goes on to say that, quote, there was already an established feeling that polygamy was inappropriate. And of course, we know that some Jewish sects outright prohibited polygamy. And I would argue that the apostles they shared that perspective. All right, so really quick, the fourth point is that the passages that allegedly approve of polygamy have been misunderstood. I won't get through all of these, but I will address a couple. What about Deuteronomy 21:15 through 17, which details inheritance rights for a polygamous family? A lot of people will say, like, well, the Torah literally regulates polygamy. It literally tells you what to do. When a man has 2 wives, what you're supposed to do in that. And it gives regulations and laws concerning that situation. So how could God be against polygamy? Well, first, it's a mistake to assume that the existence of laws addressing negative situations proves that God approves of the situation. Think about it. There are all kinds of laws addressing negative situations. There are laws for restitution. When someone steals something, what are you to do when someone steals something? Well, there are laws for restitution in that situation, but those laws don't legitimize theft. Deuteronomy 23:18 forbids prostitute wages from being used as payment for vows, but the existence of that law doesn't legitimize prostitution. So in the same way, the existence of a law detailing the rights of the firstborn in a less than ideal situation, that is a polygamous family, that doesn't legitimize polygamy. What about 2 Samuel 12? In 2 Samuel 12, God declares through Nathan that he gave Saul's wives to David. He even says, you know, if you needed more, I would have given you more. And he mentions a whole bunch of things of Saul's and mentions his wives along with it. So people will say, see, how can God be against polygamy if he gave David multiple wives himself? Well, first, why do we assume that God's giving David of Saul's wives entails that David married them? It's a complete baseless assumption. It's nowhere mentioned in the text. We just assume that. All the passage is saying is that Saul's entire estate has been transferred to David's care. Nothing in the text indicates that he married them at all. Second, David couldn't have married Saul's wives because he'd be violating God's laws against incest. One of Saul's wives was the mother of David's wife, Michal. So he'd be breaking God's laws against incest if he did marry them. Much more can obviously be said on that, but hopefully we can see that contrary to the complaints of feminists and others, the Bible in no way endorses polygamy. So, any questions on that before we move on? Yes, sir?
Related to polygamy, Levirate marriage.
Right.
At first glance, that one seems to be a command that would maybe set up that situation.
Sure. Okay, great question. And I do have a section on that in my upcoming book. 119 Ministries will also be having a teaching come out on this that will address that. But basically, with Levirate marriage, there are a few points that can be made. Number one, the existent, if we grant that Levirate marriage would include a man who's already married taking his brother's widow, if we assume that, that's not an endorsement of polygamy. It would only be allowed in that very specific situation. Okay, so that's the first point. So in the same way, you know, so we can't extrapolate from that a general principle that God approves of polygamy. It's only a specific situation in which it might be allowed. All right? The same thing can be said about the Sabbath. Yeshua says that if your sheep falls in a ditch, you're allowed to work on the Sabbath in order to save the life of your sheep. Well, that doesn't give us permission to break the Sabbath generally, as a general principle. So that's the first point I would make. Another point that I would make is that it's theoretical. Nowhere, when we actually look at how Levirate marriage is done, the 2 times in Scripture that it's talked about, but in neither case is it a married man that takes the widow, okay? And there are reasons to believe that there would be unmentioned or unsaid rules. And based on Leviticus 18:18, I would say that being married would be one of those unsaid rules. For example, in the issue with Tamar, right? Because, Judah had to give her one of his sons, and then he came to the third son, I forget his name, but Shiloh, thank you. He said when it came to him, he was like, well, he's too young. You know, he's not of the age to marry yet. He's not of the age to fulfill this Levirate duty yet because he's too young to marry. Well, there's nothing mentioned in the Levirate marriage law itself, any age restriction. So based on that, we could perhaps say that there are other unspoken rules, like would God demand that we break his law in Leviticus 18:18, for example? If someone was already married and if God's law, as I believe, prohibits polygamy, would God expect his people to go against that commandment? And maybe he did. Admittedly, it is, I can't make a really strong case in light of that verse. But to the other side, the most you can say is that polygamy would be allowed in a very specific situation. That's the most you can say. You can't extrapolate from that it's endorsed. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other questions before we move on to the next point? Okay. Well, we can talk about one other passage. I don't know how long I'm supposed to go, or I might supposed to be done now. You want to do one more? I'll try to wrap it up quick. One more passage? Okay. There's another common feminist objection to the Bible, and that is that they claim that the Bible commands rape victims to marry their rapists. Is that true? Does the Bible demand rape victims marry their rapists? Well, if that's true, that would be pretty disturbing, and I would probably agree with the feminist that that's pretty messed up. This objection is based on Deuteronomy 22, 28 through 29. I don't think it's true, by the way. Just get that out there at the forefront. This objection is based on Deuteronomy 22, 28 through 29, and it says that if a man seizes a young virgin and has sex with her, he is to pay her father 50 shekels of silver and marry her. So feminists will claim that this passage is clear proof that the Bible regards women as simply the property of men. According to critics, the female victim in this passage is sold to the rapist who violently attacked and degraded her. How do we address this? Well, there are several nuances in the text that are worth noting. The first point is that there is a passage directly preceding this, which is legislation clearly addressing rape. This is going to get a little technical again, but according to verses 25 through 27, which is the legislation prior to the passage in question, if a man seizes, and the Hebrew word there is chazak, if a man seizes a woman in an open field, the Torah demands he be put to death. But the young woman is presumed innocent in this case. So it seems to be a different situation, doesn't it? There seems to be something else going on. This passage, by the way, it uses a different Hebrew word for seizes than the word used in verse 28. So the verb here, in the passage about rape, 25 through 27, the verb here, according to Dr. Katie McCoy, can refer, quote, to the violent overpowering of another, and in the context of this text, clearly denotes rape. So the immediately preceding legislation does deal with rape. What do we do with this passage? What do we learn from it? Well, what we learn is that the Bible regards rape as a horrific and violent act. In fact, it's directly compared to murder. Deuteronomy 22:26 says, "For this case is like that of a man attacking and murdering his neighbor." The woman in this scenario is portrayed as a victim who is worthy of justice. She's not the property of men. She's not sold to her attacker. Her attacker is put to death, and she is considered a victim. She's believed. She's supported. So, by the way, this is unlike other ancient Near Eastern law codes like the Middle Assyrian laws, which actually did sanction sexual assault. In the Middle Assyrian laws, if someone raped a girl, that girl's father could demand, if the rapist is married, that girl's father can demand that the rapist's wife be raped. So they had like a system of retaliatory rape in the Middle Assyrian laws. So that's obviously not like the Torah, which upholds the value and the personhood and the rights of women. A woman who is raped, she is a victim who is worthy of justice. Her attacker is put to death. So why is that important? Well, like I said, when we get to verses 28 through 29, they seem to be describing a different type of situation than the situation described in verses 25 through 27. While verses 25 through 27 do speak of rape, verses 28 through 29, I submit to you, speak of a young couple's consensual sexual encounter. And there are several points that I can make to support this. First, as I already mentioned, a different word is used for seizes. So in verses 28 through 29, the word that's used is taphas. And while this word does mean to capture or to seize, really to handle, unlike chazak, it does not carry the same connotation of force. So if the biblical author intended to describe rape in verses 28 through 29, it's reasonable to think that he would use the same word. He would use chazak, which does imply force, as he does in the verses previously, but he doesn't. He uses a different word which doesn't have that same connotation. In addition to not having that same connotation of force, tafas is used in nonviolent metaphors to speak of things like God, quote, capturing the heart of Israel, like in Ezekiel 14:5. So it's capturing the heart, all right, a nonviolent metaphor. This has led some scholars to interpret the use of tafas in this passage to imply that the man seizes the woman not in a physical sense, but in an emotional sense. He captures her heart. Now, this point is especially relevant when we consider that there is a parallel legislation to this in Exodus. In Exodus 22, verses 16 through 17, it says this: "If a man seduces a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. If her father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the bride price for virgins." Did you catch that? If a man seduces a woman. So Deuteronomy 22, 28 through 29 is elaborating on this legislation in Exodus. And remarkably, rather than seizes, the Exodus passage uses the verb patah, which means seduces. So based on this parallel legislation, it's likely that this section in Deuteronomy does not deal with rape, but with seduction. In this scenario, the man, he persuades the young woman to engage in sex, and then she consents. Paul Copan, he's a Christian scholar, he writes, "Even if there is some pressure from the man, the young woman is complicit. Though initially pressured, seduced, she doesn't act against her will." So Deuteronomy is not sanctioning rape. It's not commanding that rape victims marry their rapists. It's saying that if a man seduces a young woman and she consents and they engage in premarital sex, he's to make things right. Okay? Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that the woman wasn't mistreated. I do think that she was mistreated. Deuteronomy does say that she was violated, right? Although she consented to sex, so it wasn't rape, she consented to sex, the man still dishonored her by persuading her to engage in sex without first giving her the dignity of marriage. Therefore, the Torah, what does it do? It holds the man accountable. It says you're responsible for your behavior. And therefore, it says that you must marry her. You must make this right. And also note that the father has the right to refuse. So it's not a situation where the woman just has no say in the matter. The woman's not required to marry him. There is an option that the father could refuse, and there's no reason to believe that the woman wouldn't have a say in that matter, that the father would make his daughter marry the man anyway, even if she didn't want to. In either case, contrary to the claims of critics, the Bible does not force rape victims to marry their rapists. In fact, as we've seen in verses 25 through 27, the Bible depicts rape as a horrific and violent act which is comparable to murder, and it's worthy of capital punishment. Female victims of rape are to be protected and cared for. When it comes to verses 28 through 29, the law for the couple to get married is ultimately designed for the protection of the woman. It's for her security in addition to holding men accountable. So far from degrading women, this legislation actually upholds the dignity and the personhood of women. Men aren't allowed to just use and lose a woman. They aren't allowed to use them and abuse them, love them and leave them. No, sex is important. Sex is only to be enjoyed within those covenant boundaries where she feels safe, protected, honored, cherished. It's not to be taken from her. It's not to be coerced or she's not to be persuaded to do it outside of those loving boundaries in which sex is lovingly shared and given. So when we take a closer look at these passages, what do we see? We clearly see that God has a deep concern for the protection of women. Far from reflecting the character of some misogynistic deity who views women as inferior to men, God's laws demonstrate his love and concern for women. Over and over and over again, the scriptures affirm that women are worthy of honor, dignity, and protection. So biblical Christianity is the answer to all of the evil in the world. Biblical Christianity is the answer to female oppression. That is all of my notes. If you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to answer some. Yes, Esther?
You said Sheila instead of Shiloh.
Oh, Sheila. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
I didn't know that sound quite right. That was a sh something.
Well, we can wrap it up here. If you guys don't have any, I'll just close this out in prayer real quick. You good? Okay. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this time together. Thank you. You are just so good, Lord. And I pray that this talk today, that it would edify your people, that they learned something, and they would be able to use it to be a light to the nations, to give a reason for the hope that they have within them to anyone who asks. We love you, Father. In your Son, Yeshua's name we pray. Amen.